My name is Lily Wilson. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people describe as easy to work with, calm, reliable, low maintenance, the kind of presence that doesn't raise alarms or demand attention. If you asked my colleagues back then, many would have said I was lucky. Steady job, stable routine, a quiet seat in a busy office where nothing dramatic ever happened around me. And maybe that's how this story starts, with someone who learned early how to blend in. People often underestimated me because I didn't speak quickly or loudly. I didn't interrupt. I listened more than I talked. In meetings, my notes were neat, my tone neutral, my posture relaxed. I wasn't invisible, exactly, but I wasn't registered either. I was the background hum that made everything else sound clearer. This isn't a story about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or delivering a shocking takedown. There are no screaming matches, no slammed doors, no triumphant speeches. What happened unfolded quietly over time in ways that even I didn't fully recognize until much later. The truth is, my silence made the office comfortable for everyone but me. For a long time, I believed that staying calm was the same as staying strong. That patience was maturity. That if something mattered, it would eventually be noticed without me having to point it out. I told myself I was choosing peace when, in reality, I was protecting a system that only worked because I absorbed its friction. This story traces the emotional journey of realizing that, of noticing the small moments that didn't feel right, the patterns that repeated themselves, the role I was quietly placed into without ever agreeing to it. It's about how silence can feel like safety until it starts to feel like erasure. And it's about what happened when I finally understood that speaking up didn't create disruption. It disrupted what silence had been protecting. I want to be clear about something. I'm not sharing this to dramatize my pain or to present myself as a hero. I'm sharing it because so many people live inside similar dynamics and never name them. Because quiet people are often told that if they're uncomfortable, it must be their own fault for not being louder. This is a documentary-style account of what it looks like to reclaim agency without cruelty, to choose clarity over comfort, to step out of a role without burning the building down. As you listen, you might recognize pieces of yourself, or someone you work with, or a version of you from an earlier chapter of your life. So before we go any further, let me ask you, gently, have you ever wondered who benefits most from your staying quiet? To them, I was dependable. That word followed me everywhere in the office. It appeared in performance reviews, casual compliments, and passing remarks in meetings. Lily's dependable. We can count on Lily. If Lily's handling it, it'll get done. It was said kindly, even appreciatively, and for a long time I wore it like a badge of honor. Dependable meant I arrived early and left on time. It meant my inbox was always clear, my files always organized, my calendar never missed a detail. It meant I noticed gaps before anyone else did, then quietly filled them. When something went wrong, I fixed it before it escalated. When someone forgot, I remembered. When a process broke, I patched it without making noise. What dependable didn't mean, at least not in practice, was visible. In meetings, I was rarely the one people looked at when they spoke about success. My work showed up in clean reports, smooth handoffs, and projects that somehow stayed on track. The outcomes were praised, the systems were admired, the person behind them was assumed to be replaceable or simply there. No one dismissed me outright. That's important. There was no overt cruelty, no dramatic exclusion. I was invited to meetings, copied on emails, included in team lunches. From the outside, it looked like I belonged, but belonging has layers. I was the one people talked around not to. Decisions would be discussed as if I weren't in the room. Even when they directly affected my workload, my name would be mentioned in sentences that assumed agreement. Lily can handle that. Lily won't mind. Lily's flexible. And I was. I am. I didn't correct people. I didn't interrupt to clarify assumptions. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that pushing back over small things would make me look difficult, that competence spoke for itself, that if something truly mattered, someone would ask. Looking back, I realize how carefully I maintained that image. Calm voice, neutral expressions, no visible frustration. I had learned long before this job that being agreeable made life smoother, that discomfort passed faster if you swallowed it quietly, that harmony was something you protected, even if it cost you clarity. So when my contributions were summarized by others, I nodded. When my ideas were rephrased and presented by someone else, I stayed silent. When extra tasks landed on my desk without discussion, I absorbed them. I wasn't self-pitying about it. That's the part people misunderstand. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt responsible. Responsible for keeping things running. Responsible for not being the source of tension. Responsible for making the office a place where everything flowed. The irony is that everyone benefited from that version of me. Managers trusted me because I didn't challenge them publicly. Colleagues leaned on me because I said no outright. The team felt stable because I smoothed the edges. My silence acted like insulation. It kept the temperature comfortable. For them, for me, it was different. There were moments, small, almost invisible, where I felt myself recede. When I had an insight, but chose not to share it because the room felt crowded. When I noticed a decision heading in the wrong direction, but didn't want to seem negative. When I stayed late to fix something that wasn't technically my responsibility, telling myself it was just easier this way. I didn't realize I was becoming a role instead of a person. The role was simple, reliable, quiet, accommodating, useful without being demanding, present without being influential. And the thing about roles like that is, they don't require your voice. They only require your availability. At the time, I would have told you I was fine. I liked working behind the scenes, that not everyone needs to lead from the front. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The fuller truth was that I didn't yet understand the cost of being underestimated, or how easily calm can be mistaken for consent. That understanding came later. For now, this is who I was to them. The steady presence, the safe pair of hands, the quiet, constant no one worried about losing, because they assumed I'd always be there. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. Not because it was subtle, though it was, but because it didn't register as something I was allowed to be bothered by. It was the kind of moment people shrug off without thinking, the kind that disappears as soon as it occurs, unless you carry it with you. We were in a midweek planning meeting. Nothing special. A long table, half full coffee cups, the quiet hum of the projector. I had spent the previous 2 weeks coordinating timelines between 3 departments, smoothing out conflicting priorities, and catching a compliance issue that could have delayed the entire project. I hadn't announced any of this. I never did. I'd simply updated the shared document and sent a summary email. During the meeting, our team lead pulled up the final plan. He walked everyone through it confidently, pointing to sections I had reworked late the night before. He nodded at the screen, satisfied. "This is solid," he said. "We're in good shape." Then he added casually, "Thanks to everyone for pitching in." Everyone nodded. A few people smiled. The meeting moved on. I waited for something else, not praise, just acknowledgement. A sentence, a name. It didn't come. Again, this wasn't new. Credit was often collective, but this time felt different. Maybe because I had caught the compliance issue alone. Maybe because the fix had required quiet conversations, extra hours, and careful wording to avoid escalation. Or maybe because, for the first time, I noticed the absence instead of explaining it away. Still, I said nothing. Later that day, a colleague stopped by my desk. Friendly tone, light smile. "Hey, great save on that timeline thing," she said. I heard it was messy. I thanked her, genuinely. And then she added, "Good thing you're so on top of things. I'd panic if it were me." It was meant as a compliment, I know that. But something about it landed wrong. Not sharply, more like a paper cut. Small, clean, easy to ignore. Because what she really meant was, "You'll handle it so I don't have to." That evening, I replayed the day while washing dishes. Not obsessively, just noticing. The meeting had moved on without pause. The way the praise came privately, not publicly. The way responsibility and recognition traveled on different paths. I told myself it didn't matter. The outcomes were more important than acknowledgement. That I didn't do my job for applause. All true. But here's what I didn't admit to myself then. Recognition isn't about ego. It's about accuracy, about making visible who carries what. And when that visibility is missing, something else fills the space. Assumptions. The assumption that the work is easy. The assumption that the person doing it doesn't mind. The assumption that this arrangement is fair because no one has complained. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no change in tone. But I noticed a shift in how tasks were assigned. More things landed in my queue. Because you're good at this. More last-minute fixes, more quiet expectations. And I complied. Of course I did. Because pushing back over something so small felt unreasonable. Because I couldn't point to a single offense. Because I didn't want to seem sensitive or territorial. Because the culture rewarded smoothness, not precision. But the cut was there, tiny, almost invisible. It showed up in the way I hesitated before opening my notebook, in the brief pause before I responded, sure, to a request, in the growing awareness that my calm was being counted on, not respected, not protected. Everyone else ignored it because it didn't affect them. To them, nothing had changed. The system worked. The meeting ended on time. The project moved forward. I was the only one who remembered it. Not because I was wounded, but because something inside me had registered a mismatch, a difference between what I contributed and how it was framed, between what I carried and what was seen. I didn't know then that this moment mattered. I certainly didn't label it as a turning point. I just tucked it away, the way quiet people do, with a mental note, not a complaint. But small cuts have a way of reopening if you keep using the same hand. And I was about to use mine a lot. After that first small cut, nothing changed. And that was the problem. The days went on the same way they always had. Emails, meetings, shared documents, polite greetings in the hallway. No tension, no conflict. If anything, things felt smoother. Projects moved faster. People relied on me more openly now, as if an unspoken agreement had been reached. I became the default. Not officially, there was no announcement, but functionally, if a process needed clarification, it came to me. If a client asked a difficult question, it was forwarded to my inbox. If two departments disagreed, someone would say, "Let Lily take a look. She'll figure it out." I told myself this was trust, and in some ways, it was. I had earned it. But trust without boundaries slowly turns into expectation. And expectation, when left unexamined, becomes entitlement. The dismissals weren't loud, they were procedural. A meeting was rescheduled without checking my availability, even though I was leading the prep. A deadline shortened with the assumption I'd make it work. Decisions finalized and then presented to me as fates accompli, followed by, "Hope that's okay." Hope in this context didn't mean uncertainty. It meant confidence that I wouldn't object. Each time I had a choice, and each time I chose the same thing, to stay quiet. I rationalized it carefully. I told myself I was being strategic, that speaking up would create friction over details that didn't matter in the long run, that I was protecting my reputation as someone who handled pressure well, that this phase would pass once the project ended, or once workloads evened out. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. Silence had become my reflex. I had trained myself to absorb discomfort quickly, efficiently, without making it visible. It felt responsible, mature, professional. And because nothing catastrophic happened when I stayed quiet, the behavior reinforced itself. The office rewarded that silence in subtle ways. I wasn't criticized. I wasn't excluded. I wasn't talked about negatively. In fact, people often praised my attitude. "You're so calm under pressure." "I don't know how you do it." "You're a lifesaver." What they didn't say, but what their actions communicated, was, "Keep doing this." So I did. I stopped noticing the extra hours as something unusual. I stopped counting how often my suggestions were implemented without attribution. I stopped questioning why my workload kept growing while my influence didn't. I normalized it. And normalization is powerful. Once something feels normal, you stop evaluating it. You stop asking whether it's fair or sustainable. You just adapt. I adapted by becoming more efficient, more precise. I documented everything meticulously, partly out of habit, partly because it gave me a sense of control. If I couldn't change the dynamic, at least I could understand it. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, where the imbalance surfaced, like when a junior colleague was praised in a team-wide email for keeping things organized, using a template I had created and maintained for over a year. Or when a manager joked in a meeting, "Lily will probably catch it if we miss something," and everyone laughed. I laughed too, not because it was funny, but because laughter smoothed the moment. Because challenging it would have required explaining something that felt intangible. Because I didn't yet have language for what was happening. I wasn't being attacked. I was being relied on without regard. And that's harder to confront. At home, I found myself more tired than usual. Not physically, mentally. I'd sit on the couch, notebook beside me, and stare at the wall for a few minutes before doing anything else. I told myself it was just a busy season, but a quiet question began to form, one I pushed away every time it surfaced. What would happen if I stopped? Not quite, not disappear, just stopped absorbing everything so smoothly. The idea made me uncomfortable because it implied that my value in that environment was conditional, that the calm I provided wasn't a personality trait, it was labor. So instead of answering the question, I buried it under competence. I stayed late. I fixed things. I kept my tone even. I convinced myself that this was professionalism. Looking back now, I can see how easily respect erodes when you don't name it. How silence, repeated often enough, becomes a signal, not of strength, but of availability. At the time, though, I didn't see erosion. I saw stability. I saw a system that worked, even if it leaned on me a little more than others. And I told myself that was fine. After all, nothing was wrong. Nothing, except the quiet accumulation of moments where my presence was assumed, my limits untested, and my voice increasingly unnecessary. That was how disrespect became normal, without anyone ever meaning to be disrespectful, including me. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize I had been assigned a role, not a title, not a promotion or a demotion, a function. I noticed it one afternoon when a new project was announced, a large one, high visibility, tight timeline, multiple stakeholders. As responsibilities were distributed, names were attached to outcomes. Leadership, client communication, final approval. And then there was a pause. Someone said Lily will support where needed. Support, where needed. It sounded harmless, generous even, flexible. But I felt something click into place. Support meant I would be everywhere and nowhere, involved in everything, credited for nothing. It meant I would catch the details others overlooked, smooth the transitions they rushed through, and quietly resolve issues before they reached the surface. It meant I would make other people look competent. No one asked me if that role worked for me. No one needed to. I had been performing it for months. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I began to notice how conversations shifted when I entered a room. Not dramatically, just subtly. People spoke more freely about problems, assuming I'd help solve them. Deadlines were discussed with a casual confidence that rested on my capacity to stretch. When something felt uncertain, someone would glance at me, as if checking whether the safety net was in place. I always was. The role didn't require leadership or authority. It required endurance, emotional neutrality, the ability to take on work without needing reassurance, the willingness to be useful without being seen as ambitious, reliable, invisible. I realized something else too. The role worked because I never challenged it. Not once did I say, "That's not my responsibility." Not once did I ask, "Why wasn't I consulted?" Not once did I clarify expectations in a way that made others uncomfortable. My silence made the role possible, and it made the office comfortable for everyone but me. I thought about how often I'd been told I was lucky to have such trust, how people framed my workload as a compliment, how managers praised my attitude instead of my impact. The role was framed as appreciation, but appreciation without agency is just containment. I wasn't being prepared for advancement. I wasn't being positioned for visibility. I was being stabilized, kept exactly where I was most useful. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a different way. I started watching instead of participating automatically. I listened to how decisions were justified. I noticed who spoke with certainty and who absorbed the consequences. I paid attention to whose time was protected and whose flexibility was assumed. Patterns emerged. The people whose voices carried weight were the ones who set boundaries early, the ones who asked clarifying questions in meetings, the ones who named their constraints out loud. They weren't louder than me. They were clearer. I had mistaken calm for clarity, and clarity, I was learning, is what defines a role before someone else does it for you. Once I understood the role I'd been placed in, I had to face an uncomfortable truth. I had helped design it, not intentionally, but consistently. Every time I stayed quiet to keep things smooth, I reinforced the expectation. Every time I said yes without discussion, I taught people what to ask of me. There was no villain in this realization, just a system responding to the signals it received. And the strongest signal I had sent was silence. I didn't decide to change anything that day. There was no dramatic resolve, no internal speech about standing up for myself. What changed was subtler. I stopped assuming the role was permanent. I began to understand that roles only exist as long as they're performed, and that opting out didn't require confrontation. It required intention. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a version of me that wasn't the quiet buffer, a version that still valued calm, but not at the expense of being defined by others. That thought didn't feel empowering yet. It felt destabilizing. Because if I wasn't that reliable, invisible support, who was I in that office? I didn't have the answer. Not yet. But the moment I recognized the role, it stopped being invisible. And once something is visible, it's only a matter of time before it changes. The shift didn't happen during a conflict. There was no argument, no raised voices, no breaking point that forced my hand. If you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything unusual at all. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a document that had already been approved twice. The changes were minor. formatting, wording, and a few clarifications. The kind of work that no one questioned landed on my plate, even though the decisions themselves had already been made without me. As I scrolled, I felt something unfamiliar, hesitation, not confusion, not overwhelm. A pause that came from somewhere deeper. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to fix, adjust, smooth, ready to do what I always did. And then I didn't. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and reread the email thread. Slowly, I noticed how the request had been phrased. Can you just clean this up? I noticed how the deadline had been assumed, not discussed. I noticed that the responsibility for accuracy was being handed to me, while the authority to decide had already been exercised by someone else. None of this was new. What was new was that I didn't immediately justify it. I didn't tell myself it was faster this way. I didn't frame it as teamwork. I didn't minimize it as part of the job. I simply let the discomfort exist without rushing to erase it. That was the shift. I realized that my silence wasn't just a habit, it was a mechanism, a way of keeping things predictable for others and for myself. If I stayed quiet, I knew what was expected of me. I knew my role. I knew how to succeed. Questioning it introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty felt dangerous, not because it would lead to punishment, but because it would force change. I looked around the office, people typing, talking softly, moving between meetings. Everything was calm, functional, comfortable. I thought, this system works because someone absorbs the friction. And I knew who that someone was. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a different question. Not, why are they doing this? But, why am I accepting it without pause? The answer wasn't flattering, but it was honest. Because being needed felt safer than being visible. Because fixing things quietly earned approval without risk. Because silence had protected me from conflict, even as it erased me. I finished the document. Of course I did. I wasn't ready to disrupt anything yet. But I did something small and internal. I noted it. I wrote down the date, the request, the assumptions embedded in it. Not in anger, not as evidence against anyone, just as an observation. That night, I went for a walk instead of opening my laptop again. The air was cool, the streets familiar. I replayed the day, not to criticize myself, but to understand it. I realized that I had been waiting for permission to change, for someone to notice the imbalance and correct it, for fairness to arrive organically. But fairness doesn't announce itself. It has to be articulated, and articulation requires a voice. I wasn't ready to use mine yet, but I had stopped pretending I didn't have one. The shift wasn't about action. It was about orientation. I stopped seeing my silence as a virtue. I began seeing it as a choice, one I had been making unconsciously. And once something becomes a choice, it can be changed. The next day, nothing looked different. I smiled. I responded to emails. I attended meetings. No one sensed a thing, but internally the ground had moved. I was no longer measuring success by how smoothly I absorbed pressure. I was starting to notice where that pressure came from and why it always seemed to land in the same place. That awareness didn't make me bold. It made me patient because I understood something new. Change didn't have to be loud to be irreversible. It just had to be deliberate. And that Tuesday, the one no one remembers, was the day I stopped disappearing automatically. After that Tuesday, my silence didn't disappear. It changed. On the surface, nothing about my behavior would have alarmed anyone. I still spoke calmly. I still listened more than I talked. I still did my job well. If anything, I seemed exactly the same. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer silent by default. Each time I chose not to speak, it was intentional. This distinction mattered more than I expected. Before, silence had been reactive, a reflex triggered by discomfort, by the desire to keep things smooth. Now, it has become observational. I started listening not just to what people said, but to what my silence produced. When I didn't jump in to clarify, confusion lingered longer. When I didn't immediately say yes, people explained themselves more. When I paused before responding, assumptions surfaced. It was subtle, but revealing. I began to see how often my presence had been used to close gaps prematurely, how quickly others moved on when they trusted I'd handle the details later. Without that immediate reassurance, conversations slowed. Questions were asked out loud instead of being quietly deferred to me. No one accused me of anything. No one confronted me. Most didn't even notice the change. They just adjusted slightly. And in those adjustments, I learned something important. Much of what I carried wasn't inevitable. It was optional. It existed because I had made it easy to offload. I still helped. I still contributed. But I stopped smoothing everything instantly. I let small frictions exist long enough to be seen. In meetings, if someone glossed over a complexity, I didn't immediately rescue the moment. I waited. Sometimes someone else noticed. Sometimes the meeting ended with an unresolved point, and the world didn't end. In emails, I asked clarifying questions instead of fixing things quietly. Not confrontational questions, neutral ones. Can you confirm the scope? Who's accountable for final approval? Simple sentences that redirected responsibility back to where it belonged. People began responding differently, not defensively, thoughtfully. They explained the context. They looped in others. They slowed down. And in doing so, they made their own work more visible. I realized that my previous silence hadn't just protected others from discomfort, it had protected them from accountability. And they had mistaken that protection for efficiency. At the same time, I noticed how easily my new restraint was misinterpreted. A colleague once said lightly, "You're quieter than usual lately." Another joked, "Guess we'll have to figure this one out ourselves." They laughed. I smiled. They didn't see strategy. They saw passivity, withdrawal, maybe even fatigue. That was fine. I wasn't trying to send a message yet. I was gathering information. I paid attention to who stepped up when I stepped back, to those who felt uncomfortable with ambiguity, to those who defaulted to old patterns and those who adapted. The office dynamic began to reveal its structure, where authority actually lived, where responsibility was blurred, where my silence had been acting as a bridge. I also noticed something else. I felt lighter, not because my workload had dropped dramatically, it hadn't, but because I was no longer carrying invisible expectations. I was choosing when to engage, when to ask, when to let things unfold. Silence, used deliberately, gave me space. Space to think, space to observe, space to decide. Others still mistook it for weakness, or compliance, or disengagement. They couldn't see the difference between quietness and absence, but I could. And that was enough, because I was no longer trying to be understood in real time. I was trying to understand the system I was in, fully, accurately, without cushioning it, without silence. Once a shield I hid behind became a lens. Through it, I saw patterns I'd missed before. I saw how often my calm had been used to bypass hard conversations. I saw how easily people adapted when they had to. Most importantly, I saw that I didn't need to announce a change for it to begin. I just needed to stop performing automatically. That choice, small, invisible, misunderstood, was the beginning of something irreversible. Because once you learn how much your silence has been holding together, you can never unknow it. And I was no longer willing to hold everything quietly. While everyone else adjusted to what they thought was my withdrawal, I was doing something very different. I was paying attention, not in a dramatic, investigative way. There were no secret files or late-night plotting sessions. What I did was quieter and far more thorough. I began to notice how information moved through the office, who initiated the decisions, who approved them, who carried the risk when something went wrong, and most importantly, who remembered. I had always taken notes. That wasn't new. My leather notebook had been with me for years, meeting dates, action items, timelines. Before, those notes were a tool for efficiency. Now, they have become a map. I started documenting patterns instead of tasks. When a decision was made without my input, but required my follow-through, I noted it. When accountability was vague, I wrote down who had spoken and who had stayed silent. When praise was public and labor was private, I marked the difference. None of this felt rebellious. It felt clarifying. What they never noticed was how much institutional memory I carried. I remembered why processes existed, not just how they worked. I knew which shortcuts had caused problems in the past, which compromises had been made under pressure, which temporary solutions had quietly become permanent. I knew this because I had been the one cleaning up after them, and because I was quiet, people spoke freely around me. They vented, they speculated, they admitted uncertainty. They assumed I was simply listening to be helpful, not to understand. I let them. I also began learning things outside my immediate role, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. I familiarized myself with compliance language, contractual obligations, internal policies, just enough to know where lines actually were, not where people pretended they were. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for the truth. The more I observed, the clearer it became. The system depended on my discretion, on my willingness to absorb ambiguity and resolve it quietly, on my silence when boundaries were crossed, unintentionally or otherwise. I had been the buffer between intention and impact. Without that buffer, things slowed. Questions surfaced. Small inconsistencies became visible. And instead of fixing them immediately, I watched how the organization responded. Sometimes managers stepped in, sometimes they deferred, sometimes they assumed I would handle it eventually. I didn't, unless asked clearly. That distinction mattered. What they never noticed was how much effort it took to keep everything comfortable before. How many micro decisions did I make daily to prevent friction? how often I chose diplomacy over accuracy. Now I was choosing accuracy. I also noticed how differently people treated silence, depending on who it came from. When senior staff paused, it was seen as thoughtfulness. When I paused, it was seen as availability or absence. That told me everything I needed to know about how power was being read. Still, no one challenged me. No one asked if something was wrong. Because from their perspective, nothing was broken enough to require intervention. And that's the danger of quiet systems. They fail slowly. I didn't confront anyone with what I was learning. I didn't correct narratives or demand recognition. I was still inside the system after all. My goal wasn't disruption yet. It was positioning. Positioning myself with information instead of emotion, with clarity instead of urgency. I began organizing my notes more deliberately, cross-referencing dates, saving email threads, not obsessively, methodically. I wanted to understand cause and effect, not assign blame. What surprised me most was how calm this process felt. There was no anger driving it, no desire to expose anyone, just a growing certainty that I needed to see the full picture before deciding anything else. Because once you speak, you can't unsay it. And I was no longer interested in speaking reactively. They never noticed this phase because it didn't cost them anything yet. The office still ran, deadlines were still met, the surface remained smooth. But underneath, I was learning where the weight actually sat. I was learning how much of it had been resting on me. And I was learning exactly what would happen if I ever chose to move it. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself, it prepares. And preparation, done silently, is almost always mistaken for absence. That mistake would matter later. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where I sat back, heart racing, thinking I've got them. In fact, when it finally became clear, my first reaction was disappointment. Not in anyone else, but in how predictable it all was. I was reviewing a set of documents late one afternoon. Routine on the surface. A project summary, a compliance checklist, and a few internal approvals are attached as PDFs. I'd seen versions of this dozens of times before. What made this different was timing. The approvals didn't line up. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. Just a sequence that didn't make sense unless you knew the history. A decision finalized before a required review. A sign-off that assumed a process had happened when it hadn't. The kind of thing that slides by when everything is calm, but becomes a problem when something goes wrong. Before I would have corrected it quietly, I would have emailed the right person, fixed the wording, nudged the timeline, and ensured the final record looked clean. No questions asked, no discomfort created. This time I stopped. I cross-checked my notes. I looked at older versions of the process, ones I had helped build. I reread internal guidelines, not to catch anyone out, but to confirm what I already suspected. The system relied on informal fixes. It relied on me, not officially, not intentionally, but structurally. Certain checks existed on paper, but in practice, they were bypassed under the assumption that someone, usually me, would notice and correct issues before they mattered. That assumption wasn't malicious. It was convenient. And convenience, repeated often enough, becomes dependency. The private reveal wasn't that someone else was careless. It was that my role as a silent corrector had become embedded in the workflow. My discretion wasn't just appreciated, it was required for the system to appear compliant, efficient, and smooth. That was the leverage, not power over people, power over process. And the clarity of that realization was sobering. I felt no urge to act immediately, no sense of triumph, just a quiet understanding. If I continued doing what I had always done, nothing would ever change. The system would remain comfortable, opaque, and unfairly balanced. If I spoke up clearly, formally, without cushioning, it would disrupt that comfort instantly. Not because I would be aggressive, but because I would stop absorbing the gap. I sat there for a long time, staring at my screen, letting that sink in. This wasn't about exposing mistakes. It wasn't about blame. It was about accuracy, about whether work was being done in a way that reflected reality, or in a way that depended on one person staying silent. I realized then why I had felt so uneasy for months. Why had the small cuts accumulated? Why my role had felt both essential and invisible. I had been the quiet safeguard, the invisible contingency plan. And contingency plans are never thanked, only assumed. I didn't share this realization with anyone, not a friend, not a colleague, not even myself out loud. I just acknowledged it internally and closed the documents. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I had decided what to do, but because I finally understood what I could do. The reveal didn't give me answers. It gave me options. I could continue as before, knowing exactly what my silence maintained. I could raise concerns gently, risking them being minimized or quietly reassigned back to me. Or I could speak precisely, formally, in a way that shifted responsibility out of the shadows and into the open. Each option had consequences. None of them was dramatic. All of them were irreversible in their own way. What mattered was that I was no longer guessing. I wasn't reacting to discomfort anymore. I was responding to clarity. That clarity didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel grounded. Because leverage, when it's real, doesn't need to be used loudly. It just needs to be understood. And now it was. Once you see clearly, you can't pretend you don't. That was the quiet pressure I felt in the days after the reveal. Not urgency, not fear, but inevitability. I moved through my routine with the same calm exterior, but internally, I was weighing paths, not hypotheticals, real choices. The first option was the easiest: do nothing, continue correcting things quietly, maintain the comfort of the system, keep my reputation intact, avoid any risk of being labeled difficult or disruptive. This option promised stability, but it also guaranteed that nothing would ever change. I knew exactly where that road led. I was already on it. The second option was to speak up gently, raise concerns in informal conversations, flag issues as suggestions, phrase everything carefully so no one feels challenged. I had done this before, in small ways. It rarely moved anything. The system absorbed soft feedback the same way it absorbed my labor, without shifting structure. Concerns became notes. Notes became reminders. Reminders circled back to me. That left the third option, the irreversible one, to speak with precision instead of politeness, to document concerns formally, to ask questions that required answers instead of reassurance, to stop being the buffer between what was happening and what was being recorded. This option didn't involve confrontation. It didn't involve an accusation. It involved clarity. And clarity, I understood now, was disruptive in an environment built on quiet fixes. Choosing it meant accepting that I might lose something. Not my job. Nothing was that dramatic. But my perceived ease. My reputation as someone who handled things. My place is the invisible stabilizer. I sat with that loss. I asked myself why it felt so heavy. Why was I reluctant to give up an identity that had cost me so much? The answer surprised me. Being needed had become a form of belonging. If I wasn't quietly indispensable, who was I in that office? But another question followed, one I couldn't ignore. Who benefits from me staying that way? The answer was no longer abstract. I thought about the documentation in my notebook, the patterns I had observed, the system that functioned because I stayed silent. I realized that staying quiet was no longer neutral. It was a choice that protected something I didn't agree with. And that meant I was complicit. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but effectively. That was the line I couldn't cross anymore. The decision didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no deep breath, no internal monologue about courage. I simply opened a new document and began outlining what needed to be clarified. Neutral language, factual tone, no emotional framing. I wrote about process gaps, not people. About timelines, not intentions. About accountability, not blame. I didn't send it yet. I read it the next day, and the day after that. Each time, I removed anything that sounded defensive or apologetic, anything that softened the truth unnecessarily. What remained was calm and precise. That's when I knew. I wasn't acting out of frustration. I wasn't reacting to a single incident. I was responding to a pattern. And patterns don't change unless someone names them. Choosing to speak meant accepting whatever followed. Misinterpretation, resistance, awkwardness, even temporary isolation. But not choosing meant accepting erasure. The decision point wasn't about bravery, it was about alignment. I wanted my actions to reflect what I believed, that clarity is not cruelty, and fairness doesn't require silence. So I scheduled the message, not impulsively, not dramatically, just deliberately. Once it was sent, there would be no pretending this was just how things were. And I was ready for that. After the decision was made, I didn't feel lighter. I felt focused. There's a difference. Relief comes from release. Focus comes from commitment. And at that stage, I wasn't releasing anything yet. I was aligning my actions carefully, quietly, so nothing depended on impulse. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't hint at it. I didn't change my demeanor. From the outside, I was still Lily, calm, composed, reliable. If anyone had asked how I was doing, I would have answered honestly and vaguely. Busy, but fine. Inside, though, I was moving with intention. The document I had drafted wasn't a complaint. It was a clarification request, formally structured, referencing existing policies and timelines. I addressed it to the appropriate channel, not to a single person, not privately, not emotionally. That choice mattered. Private conversations could be softened, redirected, or quietly neutralized. Formal clarity, shared through the right process, had to be acknowledged. Even if nothing changed immediately, it would exist in the record. Before sending it, I made sure everything I referenced was accurate. Dates matched, language aligned with policy. No speculation, no assumptions, just facts that spoke for themselves. Then I sent it, and I went back to work. That was the part no one noticed. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't hover over my inbox. I didn't rehearse explanations in my head. I continued doing my job, just without filling gaps that weren't mine anymore. I stopped preemptively correcting things that hadn't been assigned to me clearly. If something was ambiguous, I asked for clarification in writing. If accountability wasn't defined, I didn't guess. These weren't refusals. They were boundaries expressed through process. At first, the impact was almost invisible. A few delays, a couple of follow-up emails. Meetings ran slightly longer because decisions had to be articulated instead of assumed. No one connected this to me. They couldn't. I hadn't changed my tone or my workload in a way that looked dramatic. I had simply stopped absorbing ambiguity. What changed was the system's response. People began looping in additional stakeholders, just to be safe. Approvals took longer. Questions that had once been silently resolved now had to be answered out loud. I watched all of this without commentary. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means letting cause and effect play out without interference. A manager once stopped by my desk and asked casually, "Hey, did you notice this part of the process feels slower lately?" I nodded. "It's more explicit now," I said. "There are more defined steps." That was all. No accusation. No explanation of why. Just an observation. They nodded too, thoughtful, and walked away. The office didn't feel hostile. If anything, it felt slightly unsettled, like furniture had been rearranged overnight. Nothing was broken. Nothing was wrong. But things no longer flowed automatically. That's what silence had been providing. Lubrication. Without it, the system had to carry its own weight. I also noticed how careful people became in their language. Requests were phrased more clearly. Responsibilities were spelled out instead of implied. Some people adapted quickly. Others seemed frustrated, though they couldn't quite name why. No one blamed me. Because I hadn't accused anyone. I had simply stopped protecting the gaps. This phase required patience. It would have been easy to step back in when things felt awkward. Easy to fix a delay quietly, to reassure someone, to smooth a moment of uncertainty. I didn't, not out of spite, but out of respect for the process I had chosen. I understood something crucial then. Real change rarely announces itself as change. It announces itself as an inconvenience. An inconvenience makes people pay attention. Still, I didn't push. I didn't escalate. I didn't demand recognition. I let the system feel its own contours. Moving in silence meant trusting that clarity, once introduced, would do its work without me narrating it. And it did. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that something had begun. And there was no turning back. The consequences didn't arrive with drama. They arrived as an absence. At first, it showed up in small ways. A report that took longer to finalize. A meeting that ended without a clear decision. An email chain that stretched on, unresolved, because no one stepped in to quietly tie it together. People noticed, but not immediately. When you're used to things running smoothly, you don't question the system. You assume someone has it handled. It takes time before the absence of that invisible labor becomes visible. I watched that realization spread slowly. A colleague sighed in a meeting and said, "Didn't we used to move faster on these?" Another replied, "Maybe timelines are just tighter lately." No one said my name. They didn't connect the slowdown to me because nothing about my presence had changed. I was still there, still contributing, still calm. What had changed was what I no longer absorbed. Without a buffer, small inefficiencies accumulated. Decisions that relied on informal fixes now required formal ones. Questions that used to be resolved quietly were now circulating longer, and that circulation created friction. Managers began asking for clearer documentation. Stakeholders requested more detailed justifications. Processes were revisited, not because anyone wanted to, but because they had to. I noticed a shift in tone before I noticed it in behavior. Conversations became more cautious. People double-checked assumptions. There was a subtle tension, not conflict, just awareness. A sense that something needed attention, though no one could quite articulate what. The system was encountering itself. One afternoon, a project review meeting ran over by nearly 30 minutes. No one was angry, but there was frustration, unfocused, dispersed. People left the room quieter than they entered. As I gathered my things, someone said, lightly, "We used to be better at anticipating issues." I almost responded, almost, but this wasn't the moment, and I wasn't the narrator anymore. The consequences weren't punishment. They were feedback. Without my silence holding everything together, the organization had to confront its own habits, its reliance on unspoken labor. It's comfortable with ambiguity as long as someone else absorbed the cost. I saw people trying to fix that discomfort. Some overcompensated, adding steps, looping in more people, creating layers. Others resisted, pushing for speed, dismissing concerns as overthinking. None of it was malicious. It was an adjustment. An adjustment is rarely graceful. What surprised me most was how often people began asking questions out loud that I had been answering silently for years. Who owns this decision? Has this actually been reviewed? Are we aligned on scope? Hearing those questions spoken openly felt strange, not validating, just clarifying. This was what clarity sounded like when it wasn't filtered through one person. I also noticed something else. People stopped assuming I would fix things after the fact. Requests became more precise. Deadlines were negotiated instead of imposed. Some tasks that used to land on my desk never did again. Not because I had refused them, but because they were being handled upstream. That was the consequence no one had anticipated. The loss of silent labor doesn't just create gaps, it redistributes responsibility. And redistribution is uncomfortable for those who benefited most from the old arrangement. Still, no one confronted me. There was no meeting about changes in attitude, no whisper campaign, no tension was directed my way, because from the outside I was doing exactly what I had always done, just without the invisible extras. The system was adjusting to a more accurate version of itself. And that adjustment came with discomfort, inefficiency, and a growing awareness that something had shifted. People began to feel that shift before they understood it. And once felt, it couldn't be unfelt. There's a moment in every slow unraveling when people realize the problem isn't temporary. At first, inconvenience is treated like a phase, something to push through, a busy period, a rough patch that will smooth itself out once everyone adjusts. That's where the office stayed for a while. But gradually, a different realization began to take shape, one that was harder to articulate and even harder to address. The old ease wasn't coming back. I noticed it in the way meetings were scheduled more carefully, how managers began requesting written summaries instead of relying on verbal check-ins, in the new emphasis on accountability that felt reactive rather than intentional. People were trying to fix the discomfort without naming its source. They added tools, templates, checklists. None of it quite worked. Because what had been lost wasn't a process. It was a person's unspoken labor. And that kind of loss doesn't respond to surface level solutions. I saw frustration appear in subtle ways, a sharper tone in emails, longer pauses before decisions, a growing defensiveness when questions were asked. Someone once said, exasperated, "We're overcomplicating things lately." No one replied, because no one could say why. I also noticed how often people began referencing the way we used to do things, as if the past were a method, not a moment. They missed the outcome, not the mechanism. At some point, managers started having side conversations. I wasn't included in most of them, which was telling. When systems change, people often look for fixes without consulting the ones who understand the system best, especially if that understanding has been invisible. They were trying to restore comfort without disrupting hierarchy. That's when it became too late. Not because change couldn't be reversed, but because it couldn't be reversed quietly. To return to the old way would have required someone to ask me directly to resume absorbing ambiguity, to unofficially take responsibility for gaps again, to smooth things over without documentation. And now that ask would have been explicit, which meant it couldn't happen. Once something unspoken becomes visible, it loses its power. Once silence stops being assumed, it can't be demanded without acknowledgement. I hadn't made an announcement. I hadn't drawn a line in the sand. But the system had already adjusted to my absence in that role. Trying to reinstate it would have required a conversation no one wanted to have. I saw the panic before I heard it. A manager approached me one afternoon and asked, carefully, "Do you feel like you have enough clarity in your role right now?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that. I considered my answer. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. They nodded, relieved, or perhaps unsettled. I couldn't tell. Another time, someone said, half joking, "We really relied on you to catch things before. I guess we all have to be more on top of it now." There it was, acknowledgement without repair. By then, the office had changed too much to pretend otherwise. Responsibilities had shifted, processes had been documented, expectations had been redefined. Even if I wanted to go back and I didn't, I couldn't. The quiet contract had expired. What people were feeling wasn't anger toward me, it was regret toward the ease they hadn't known they were consuming. Regret doesn't always look like remorse. Sometimes it looks like confusion, like frustration, like searching for solutions that don't exist anymore. I watched it happen without satisfaction, without bitterness, just understanding. Because this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about accuracy, catching up to comfort. The system was no longer protected by silence, and that meant everyone had to participate honestly, or not at all. By the time people realized that, there was nothing left to quietly fix. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It was a scheduled meeting, a small room, two managers, neutral expressions, the kind of setup that usually signals tension, even when no one says so out loud. I wasn't nervous, not because I felt powerful, but because I felt prepared. They began by talking about recent challenges, about processes feeling heavier, about timelines stretching. Their language was careful, non-accusatory. They weren't looking for a culprit. They were looking for orientation. At some point, one of them said, "We wanted to check in and understand your perspective." That was new. I listened without interrupting. I let them finish. When it was my turn, I spoke calmly, the same way I always had. But this time, I didn't soften the truth. I didn't list grievances. I didn't revisit old moments. I spoke about patterns. I explained how ambiguity had been managed informally in the past, how responsibilities had often been implied rather than defined. I had previously filled those gaps quietly because it seemed helpful. I said that I had shifted toward more explicit processes, not to slow things down, but to make accountability clearer and more sustainable. There was no emotion in my voice, just precision. One of them asked, "So, are you saying you felt overwhelmed before?" I paused. "No," I said. "I felt relied on in ways that weren't visible." That landed differently. They nodded slowly. No defensiveness, no denial. Another manager said, "We didn't realize how much you were carrying." "I know," I replied, and I meant it, not as criticism, but as fact. The room stayed quiet for a moment, not awkwardly, thoughtfully. They asked what I needed going forward. That question mattered. I didn't ask for a promotion. I didn't demand recognition. I didn't threaten anything. I asked for role clarity, for decisions to be documented before being finalized, for accountability to be shared rather than assumed. Simple things, reasonable things, things that once said out loud sounded obvious. There was no apology. There didn't need to be. Apologies belong to blame. This conversation was about alignment. We talked through how responsibilities would be redistributed, how communication would change, how processes would be adjusted to reflect reality instead of relying on individual discretion. By the end of the meeting, nothing felt dramatic, but everything felt different. When I left the room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt complete, because for the first time my experience had been named accurately, without exaggeration, without defensiveness. The confrontation had no heat, because I hadn't waited until I was burned. I realized something then. Calm doesn't mean compliant. Silence doesn't mean agreement. And speaking up doesn't have to sound like a fight to change a system. All it takes is clarity, delivered without apology. And once that clarity exists, everyone has to respond to it, one way or another. Who I am now looks very similar to who I was before, at least from the outside. I still speak calmly. I still listen carefully. I still value precision over noise. If you passed me in the hallway or sat across from me in a meeting, you might not notice anything remarkable. That's intentional. The difference isn't in how I present myself, it's in what I carry and what I no longer do. I am no longer the quiet container for everyone else's uncertainty. I still contribute deeply, but I do it within defined boundaries. I ask questions early. I clarify ownership before stepping in. I let pauses exist without rushing to fill them, and I don't feel guilty about any of it. What changed wasn't my personality, it was my relationship with responsibility. I stopped equating usefulness with worth. I stopped believing that being easy to work with meant being endlessly flexible. I learned that calm has weight when it's paired with clarity. In the months after that conversation, the office settled into a new rhythm. Not smoother, more honest. Decisions took a little longer, but they stuck. Accountability shifted from assumption to agreement. People still trusted me, but now that trust was explicit, not extractive. When someone asks for my input, they wait for it. When they need support, they define the scope. When something isn't mine to carry, it stays where it belongs. And when I speak, people listen, not because my voice got louder, but because it's no longer cushioning the truth. I've noticed something else too. I'm not as tired, not because the work is lighter, but because the work I do now matches the role I occupy. There's a quiet relief in that alignment, in knowing that I'm no longer quietly compensating for structural gaps. I didn't become harder, I became clearer. There's no bitterness in that, no resentment. I don't replay the past looking for justice. The past served its purpose. It taught me what silence can protect and what it can cost. I still believe in composure, still value discretion, still choose my words carefully. But I no longer disappear behind them. Who I am now is someone who understands that presence isn't measured by how much you absorb, but by how accurately you show up. I'm still calm, just no longer invisible. There's a simple lesson people often expect from stories like this: something clean, something directive. Speak up sooner. Don't let people take advantage of you. Know your worth. Those ideas aren't wrong, but they're incomplete. What this experience taught me is more uncomfortable and more useful. Silence is never neutral. It feels neutral when it keeps things calm. It feels mature when it avoids conflict. It feels safe when it allows you to belong without risk. But over time, silence doesn't just prevent disruption, it protects whatever system already exists. In my case, my silence protected efficiency for others and exhaustion for me. It provided unclear accountability. It provided comfort that depended on invisible labor. And because everything appeared to work, no one had an incentive to question it, including me. The moment I stopped treating silence as a virtue and started treating it as a choice, everything changed. Not because I became louder, not because I demanded anything extraordinary, but because I stopped absorbing what wasn't mine to carry. Speaking up didn't destroy relationships. It clarified them. It didn't create chaos. It revealed where the order had been artificial. It didn't make it difficult for me. It made expectations accurate. And perhaps most importantly, it didn't turn me into someone else. I didn't have to abandon calm to gain agency. I didn't have to perform confidence or dramatize pain. I didn't have to punish anyone to reclaim myself. I just had to stop protecting a system that only worked when I stayed quiet. There's a particular kind of quiet person who will recognize this story immediately. Someone dependable, thoughtful, often underestimated. Someone whose strength is mistaken for availability, whose patience is mistaken for permission. If that's you, I want to be clear about something. Your silence has weight. Your calm is doing work. whether you acknowledge it or not. The question isn't whether you should speak more. The question is what your silence is currently maintaining. Because once you see that clearly, staying quiet stops being harmless. And choosing clarity, calmly, deliberately, becomes an act of alignment, not aggression. I didn't leave my job in anger. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't win anything visible. What I gained was something quieter and more lasting: authorship over my role and peace that didn't depend on erasing myself. That's what quiet dominance actually looks like. Not control over others, but control over what you no longer carry. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever realized that your silence was making everyone else comfortable while slowly costing you yourself? Share your experience in the comments.